My millionaire son visited me and said, "How do you like the country house, Mom?" I answered him, "What country house? I've lived here forever." He went pale. That very night, my daughter-in-law appeared on the news. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story to the end and comment from what city you are watching me. That way I can see how far my story has reached." My name is Evelyn, and I'm 64 years old. I never thought that at my age I'd be living off the charity of others. But life has a twisted way of bringing us to our knees when we least expect it. It was a Tuesday afternoon when I heard the low growl of an expensive engine dying outside the house where I stay. From the kitchen window, I watched Marcus, my son, step out of his black BMW. He was wearing a suit that probably cost more than my grocery budget for a quarter of the year. He looked prosperous, sharp, everything a mother could want for her boy. My heart started beating a little faster. Marcus didn't visit often. In fact, it had been 8 months since I'd seen him in the flesh. Our entire relationship had shrunk down to sporadic phone calls where he always sounded rushed, always chasing something more important. I opened the door before he could even knock. His smile was wide, stretching a little too tight across his face. "Hey, Mom," he said, pressing a kiss to my cheek. "You look good, Marcus. What a surprise," I answered, trying to swallow down my nerves. "What brings you by?" He walked right in without waiting for an invitation, his eyes scanning the room with that exact look I remembered from when he was just a kid. He was evaluating, judging. His gaze snagged on Claire Miller's old furniture, the sun-bleached curtains, the worn-out rug in the living room. "So how's the country house treating you, Mom?" he asked, casual as could be, like we were talking about the weather. I froze. The words just jammed in my throat. I stared at him, waiting for the punchline of some cruel joke, but his face was dead serious. "What country house?" I finally managed to push the words out. "Marcus, I'm staying here as a favor." His smile vanished, wiped clean, like someone had snatched off a mask. All the color drained right out of his face. "What do you mean, a favor?" His voice sounded thin, like it was coming from the other end of a long tunnel. "This is Claire's house. She lets me stay here as long as I take care of the place and keep it clean, while she's out in Arizona with her daughter." The words spilled out of my mouth, heavy as painful confessions. "I thought you knew." Marcus collapsed onto the sofa, dragging his hands through his hair. It was the exact same thing he used to do when he was little, and something completely baffled him. "I don't understand," he muttered. "Stephanie told me you had your own place, that you were comfortable, that you didn't need a thing." Stephanie. My daughter-in-law's name dropped between us like a heavy stone sinking into dark water. I felt that familiar tight knot twist in my stomach, the one that always showed up whenever I thought about her. "Marcus," I said softly, taking a seat across from him, "I haven't seen a single dime from you in over 2 years." "Impossible," he snapped, shooting up from the couch. "I send money religiously every single month, $500. Stephanie handles the transfers." The ground beneath me felt like it was giving way. $500 a month. For 2 years. $12,000 I had never laid eyes on. "Son," my voice cracked, "I've been scrubbing other people's houses just to put food in my mouth. There are nights I go to bed on an empty stomach because the money simply doesn't stretch." Marcus jumped to his feet so violently he knocked over the coffee table. His eyes looked glassy, like a man waking up from a very long, very deep sleep. "She told me you were refusing the money out of pride," he whispered, "that you wanted to be independent." A bitter laugh tore its way out of my throat. "Pride, Marcus? I've had to beg Claire for loans just to buy my blood pressure medication. Last month, I had to choose between paying bus fare to see the doctor and buying groceries." I watched my son process the sheer weight of what I was saying. His fists clenched, uncurled and clenched again. The polished, successful man who had walked through my door was crumbling to pieces right in front of me. "I called her last week to ask if you needed anything," he said, his voice raw. "She told me you were doing perfectly fine, that she had just seen you and that you were so happy out in your little country house." "I haven't seen her in 6 months," I replied. "The last time we spoke was when she called to tell me you were just too swamped with work to come visit." Marcus squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the reality of what he was hearing. When he opened them, something inside him had shifted. There was a cold, hard edge to his stare that I had never seen before. "Where are the letters I wrote you?" he asked suddenly. "What letters?" "I sent them with the checks every month. Letters telling you how much I missed you, asking how you were feeling." I slowly shook my head. "I never got any letters, Marcus. No letters? No checks?" The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus walked over to the window, staring blankly out at his car, as if he didn't even recognize it. His shoulders were trembling just a little. "Mom," he said, keeping his back to me, "I need you to tell me the complete truth. Everything that's happened over these last couple of years." So I did. I told him about the nights I spent staring at the ceiling, agonizing over what I could have possibly done wrong to make my only child abandon me. I told him about the times I called his office, only for Stephanie to tell me he was locked in crucial meetings. I told him about my 63rd birthday, sitting all alone at the kitchen table, eating soup straight out of a can because I couldn't afford anything else. Every single word felt like tearing a piece of my soul right out of my chest, but he needed to know. He had to understand that living like a ghost wasn't a choice I had made. When I finally stopped talking, Marcus was still facing the window. His chest was rising and falling, like a man fighting for air. "Forgive me." He finally said the words, barely scraping past his lips. But I knew that forgiveness wasn't going to fix this. Not this time. Marcus stayed late into the night. I watched him pace, checking his phone over and over, dialing numbers and hanging up before anyone could answer. Finally, around 9 o'clock, I heard him get Stephanie on the line. "We need to talk," he told her. His voice sounded entirely alien to me. It was dead calm, ice cold. I couldn't hear what she said on the other end, but I watched Marcus's jaw lock tight. "I don't care if you have plans. Cancel them." When he ended the call, he looked at me with a face that instantly took me back to when he was a teenager, who had just realized a friend had stabbed him in the back. "I'm going home to get to the bottom of this," he told me. "Will you be all right here tonight?" I nodded. Even though the truth was, I wasn't sure of anything anymore. My entire reality had been flipped upside down in a matter of hours. The next morning, Marcus came back. He looked like a man who hadn't slept a single second. His eyes were bloodshot, carrying that hollow, devastated look people get when they find out everything they believed in was a lie. "What happened?" I asked, though my gut already knew the answer. He dropped heavily into a chair at the kitchen table. "Stephanie denies it all. She says there was never any money set aside for you, that I'm just confused." "And do you believe her?" Marcus let out a harsh, dry laugh. "I spent the entire night going through our bank statements. There are monthly withdrawals of $1,500, all in cash, every month for the last 2 years. When I pushed her on it, she claimed it was just for household expenses." $1,500 in cash every month for the house? That's exactly what I said. She just told me I had no idea how expensive it is to maintain our lifestyle. Marcus pressed the heels of his hands into his temples. "Mom, I found something else." He pulled out his phone and slid it across the table. It was a gallery of photos. Stephanie sitting in high-end restaurants, weighed down by luxury shopping bags. Stephanie lounging at a resort spa I recognized from glossy television commercials. "These were taken over the last 6 months," he explained. "She posted them all on her Instagram. Look at the dates." I leaned in, studying the screen. There was a picture of Stephanie in some exclusive salon, time-stamped on the exact same day I had swallowed my pride to beg Claire for grocery money. "And this one." Marcus swiped his thumb across the glass. "This is from last week." It was a shot of Stephanie draped in a plush robe at a luxury spa up in Napa Valley. The caption read, "Needed a break from the stress. Sometimes a girl just has to take care of herself." "That same week," Marcus said, his voice shaking with rage, "she told me she had driven out to visit you. Said you were doing fine, just feeling a little down. She told me I shouldn't come by because you might get overwhelmed by too much company." I felt like someone had driven a fist straight into my gut. "Marcus, I don't have company. You are the very first person to walk through that door in months." My son shut his eyes and buried his face in his hands. How could I be so completely stupid? You aren't stupid, I told him, feeling my own anger finally starting to boil over. You trusted your wife. That's what you're supposed to do. But I should have called you myself. I should have driven out here. Every time you tried, she had an excuse ready. I was sick. I was traveling. I was out with friends. The memories started clicking together in my head like the jagged pieces of a very dark puzzle. Marcus, do you remember last Christmas? She told me you didn't want to celebrate, that you were just going through an antisocial phase. I spent that entire Christmas alone, waiting for the phone to ring. My voice broke. I cooked dinner for two, just praying you'd change your mind and show up. I watched the realization absolutely crush him. Marcus stood up abruptly and started pacing the floorboards. There's more, he finally said. I pulled our phone records. Stephanie has been blocking your number on our home line. What does that even mean? It means whenever you tried to call me, the phone never even rang on my end. She rigged the system so your calls were dumped straight into a voicemail box that only she checked. The betrayal felt physical, like a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. Why would she do something like this? Marcus stopped pacing and looked at me. I don't know, Mom, but I'm going to find out. He pulled out his phone and started making calls, first to his bank, demanding itemized statements, then to someone he referred to as a private investigator. Yeah, I need you to run a deep dive on my wife's finances, he said into the receiver. Stephanie Morrison. I want to know exactly where every cent has gone for the last 2 years. While he talked, my mind drifted back to all those times I had desperately tried to reach him. The calls that went into the void, the messages that vanished, the letters I had poured my heart into but never mailed because I couldn't afford the stamps. The investigator is going to tear everything apart, he told me when he hung up. Bank accounts, credit cards, everything. And what if he finds something? Marcus looked at me with a darkness I hadn't seen in him since he was a boy, defending his friends from a neighborhood bully. Then Stephanie is going to wish she was never born. That afternoon, while Marcus waited for the investigator to hit him back with the initial findings, he kept dropping pieces of the nightmare in my lap. Remember when you caught pneumonia 2 years ago? He asked. Of course, I nearly died because I couldn't afford the antibiotics. Stephanie told me you were perfectly fine, said it was just a common cold. She talked me out of visiting because she said I might catch it right before a massive presentation at work. I was in a hospital bed for 3 days. Marcus's knuckles turned white. She knew. She had to have known. Marcus's phone buzzed. It was the private investigator. You got something? Marcus answered on the first ring. I could only hear his side of the conversation, but the silence between his words said enough. How much? A long pause. For how long? An even longer pause. Do you have the proof? When he finally dropped the phone from his ear, he looked like he had just stared into a grave. Mom, he said slowly, I think this is a hell of a lot worse than we thought. The next few days felt like sleepwalking through a nightmare, watching everything you thought was solid melt into a lie. Marcus brought in James Reynolds, a private investigator, who made his living exposing family fraud. I didn't even know that was a real job until he walked through the door. Your daughter-in-law has been meticulous, James explained during our first sit-down at Claire's house. But people like her always leave a trail. Marcus sat right beside me, scribbling furiously in a legal pad, like he was prepping for trial. The change in him was staggering. The polished, distant executive was gone, replaced by something fierce and unstoppable. What have you pulled up so far? He asked James. Well, the monthly $500 transfers stopped dead exactly 2 years ago. James began flipping through a thick stack of printouts. But the cash withdrawals didn't. Stephanie has been bleeding that money straight into her own pockets. What kind of expenses? I asked, though my stomach churned at the thought of knowing. James gave me a look full of quiet pity before he answered. High-end beauty treatments, designer clothes, jewelry, luxury travel. Over the last 24 months, she has burned through more than $60,000 on what she legally categorizes as personal care. $60,000. It was more money than I had touched in a lifetime. And the letters, Marcus pressed. The letters I wrote to my mother. Right. James pulled a heavy manila folder from his briefcase. I found something very interesting regarding those." He flipped it open, revealing a thick stack of envelopes. I instantly recognized Marcus's sharp handwriting looping across the paper. "Where did you get those?" Marcus leaned across the table, his face tight with disbelief. "Sitting in a cardboard box marked Old Records out in your garage. There are over 20 letters addressed to Evelyn, not a single one of them opened." Marcus picked up the top envelope. His hands were shaking as he tore the paper, pulled out the letter, and started reading aloud. "Dear Mom, I hope you're doing well and that the country house is finally giving you the peace you deserve. This month's money is a little delayed because of a bank error, but Stephanie promised me she'd get it sorted out and sent to you by tomorrow." His voice cracked. He couldn't force the rest of the words out. I reached across the table and slid the paper from his fingers. I picked up right where he left off. "I miss our talks. Stephanie tells me you've been incredibly busy with your new friends at the gardening club, but I'd really love to see you soon. Maybe next week I can drive up." Tears spilled hot down my face. "Gardening club," I whispered. "I don't even know anyone who owns a garden." James cleared his throat softly. "There's more, Evelyn. Did you ever try calling your son at his office?" "Dozens of times," I said, "especially when I was desperate for grocery money. But his assistant always told me he was locked in meetings." I tracked down Mary Sanders, his assistant. She told me she never actually received a single call from you. Stephanie gave her strict direct orders. If an older woman called asking for Marcus, Mary was instructed to say he was completely unavailable. Marcus shoved his chair back so hard it crashed to the floor. "Stephanie told Mary that?" "Yes. According to Mary, Stephanie sat her down and explained that you were suffering from early-onset dementia and that your rambling phone calls were deeply upsetting Marcus while he was trying to work." "Dementia?" I cried out, the shock finally giving way to pure, blinding anger. "She told his office I lost my mind?" "It gets worse," James continued, his tone relentless. "Stephanie also reached out to your old neighbors and friends. She told them you had become severely paranoid and were fabricating wild stories about your family abandoning you." The room started spinning. She hadn't just stolen my money and built a wall between me and my son. She had systematically assassinated my character. "That's why Rose Martin stopped waving to me," I muttered, thinking of the woman who had lived next door to me for a decade. "That's why Carol never called me back." Marcus was pacing the room like a caged animal. "What else, James? Don't hold back. I need to know every piece of it." "Well, there's one last thread. Stephanie has been telling people in your circle that you're pulling in a massive government pension and don't need a dime of outside help." "Government pension? You mean Social Security," James clarified. "But when I pulled the actual records, your Social Security check barely hits $800 a month. Stephanie has been casually mentioning to everyone that you clear over $2,000. $800 doesn't even cover rent on a decent apartment," I said, the humiliation burning like acid in my chest. Marcus stopped pacing. He dropped to his knees right in front of my chair and grabbed both of my hands. "Mom, you are never going to live through this again. I swear to God." "But there's one thing I just don't understand," I said, looking between the two men. "Why? Why go to these insane lengths?" James and Marcus shared a dark, loaded look. "That was the missing puzzle piece," James said. "But I think we just found it." He pulled out another folder twice as thick as the first. "Mr. Morrison, did your wife ever mention personal financial trouble, heavy debts from before you tied the knot?" Marcus frowned. "No, never. She always played it like she came from old money." "Well, it turns out that was a complete fabrication." James flipped the file open. "Stephanie was drowning in credit card debt long before she met you. Massive. High-interest debt." "How much?" Marcus demanded. "Roughly $60,000 by the time you two walked down the aisle. Money she burned through trying to project the image of a wealthy, independent woman." "But that was years ago," Marcus argued. "I wiped out her debts when we got married." "You wiped out the ones she told you about," James corrected, "but she never stopped swiping. She has quietly built a mountain of new debt in accounts you have zero access to. James slid a stack of bank statements across the wood. Credit cards solely in her name, personal loans, even a string of payday cash advances. Marcus flipped through the pages, the blood draining from his face with every turn. This is well over $100,000. Exactly. And this is where your mother's money comes into play. Stephanie has been siphoning that cash to make the minimum monthly payments on this hidden debt, keeping the wolves away from the door so you wouldn't notice. The kitchen went dead silent as the reality of it sank into our bones. She hadn't just stolen my livelihood and butchered my relationship with my only child. She had been using my sheer survival to cover up her own pathetic financial mess. "Is there more?" Marcus asked, his voice rough as sandpaper. James gave a slow, grim nod. "A lot more. But I think we need to take a breather. This is a heavy dose to swallow in one sitting." After James packed up and left, Marcus and I just sat in the quiet for a long time. The sheer weight of the betrayal felt like a house sitting on my chest. "How the hell did I not see it?" Marcus finally whispered into the silence. "Because she's a professional," I answered. "And because you loved her, you trusted her." But the red flags were everywhere. I should have... "Marcus," I cut him off sharply. "Stop. She played us both." But behind my eyes, the gears were turning. If Stephanie was ruthless enough to orchestrate all of this, what else was buried in the dark? And more terrifyingly, what was she going to do when she realized we were pulling up the floorboards? Like he was reading my mind, Marcus leaned in. "Mom, you need to watch your back right now. Stephanie cannot know we're looking into this." "Do you think she'd actually hurt someone?" Marcus looked at me with an expression that will haunt me until the day I die. "After everything I've seen today, I don't know where her bottom is anymore." A week after that sit-down, with James, Marcus walked through the front door, wearing a look I had never seen before. It wasn't just anger. It wasn't just grief. It was something jagged and incredibly dangerous. "What happened?" I asked the second I saw his face. "James hit the mother lode, Mom, and it goes way, way deeper than just stealing from you." He dropped onto the sofa like a stone and pulled out his phone. "Stephanie wasn't just bleeding you dry. She's been running a massive scam on a lot of people." My blood turned to ice water. "What are you talking about?" "You remember that charity she worked for? The one she always bragged about helping struggling families?" Marcus let out a laugh that sounded like shattered glass. "Well, it turns out she was helping a struggling family, her own." He turned the phone around. Staring back at me was a local news article. The headline screamed, "Charity Director Arrested in $500,000 Embezzlement Scheme." And right beneath it was a photo of Stephanie, hands cuffed behind her back, flanked by two stone-faced detectives. "When did this happen?" I gasped, unable to tear my eyes from the screen. "Last night. James called me at the crack of dawn. Apparently, the feds have been quietly building a case against her for months." I read the article, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. Stephanie had been systematically draining funds from an organization built to help elderly people living below the poverty line. The irony was so vicious, it actually made me physically sick. $500,000, I whispered. "For how long?" 3 years, right around the exact time your checks mysteriously stopped arriving. Marcus stood up and started pacing the rug. "It gets worse, Mom. So much worse." He pulled a thick manila envelope from his leather briefcase. "James handed me this an hour ago. It's the unsealed federal indictment." He ripped it open and started reading the cold, hard legal print. "Stephanie Morrison, 34, allegedly diverted federal and private funds earmarked for elderly assistance programs, including emergency housing, food security, and prescription medication stipends." Every single word felt like a slap across the face. While I was literally starving, while I was rationing my blood pressure pills, Stephanie was stealing the exact money meant to keep people like me alive. "But wait," Marcus said, his voice trembling with pure, unadulterated fury. This is the part that actually made me want to throw up. He pulled out a secondary document. Mrs. Morrison justified a significant portion of the fraudulent disbursements by claiming the funds were being utilized to provide full-time care for her elderly mother-in-law, who purportedly suffered from advanced dementia and required specialized facility care. The room stopped spinning. Everything just stopped. What? Yeah, Mom. She used you as her cover story. She looked federal auditors in the eye and told them the missing cash was paying for your room and board at an assisted living facility. But I've never stepped foot inside a facility. Exactly. She forged the invoices. She forged medical evaluations. She faked the entire paper trail. Marcus slammed the documents down on the coffee table. She weaponized your name and your age to steal from people who were literally begging for help. I felt a wave of intense nausea wash over me. She hadn't just robbed me blind. She had used my ghost to rob other desperate, terrified old people. Is there more? I asked, not entirely sure my heart could take another hit. Marcus gave a grim nod. The FBI dug up an offshore account, one she opened strictly under her maiden name, where she was washing the stolen cash. How much is in it? When they slapped the cuffs on her, she had over $200,000 sitting in the dark. $200,000. While I was living on the grace of a friend while I was counting pennies just to buy a loaf of bread, she had a fortune hoarded away in secret. Marcus, I said slowly, looking him dead in the eye, I need you to look at me and tell me the absolute truth. How long were you completely in the dark about this? Mom, I swear to God I had zero idea. If I had known... I'm not blaming you. I cut him off. But I need to make sense of this. For 2 entire years, did she look you in the face and tell you I was fine? Marcus sank into the chair across from me, his eyes shining with unshed tears. Every single time I brought you up, she told me you were thriving, that you had your routines, your friends, that you were absolutely loving your independent life. And you just bought it. Why wouldn't I? She was my wife. She was the one person in the world I was supposed to trust implicitly. Just then, Marcus's phone shattered the silence. It was James. What do you have? Marcus answered instantly. I could only hear his clipped responses, but the tone of his voice told me they had just hit another landmine. Are they sure? A tight pause. How many victims? Another pause. I understand. Yeah, we'll be there. When he hung up, he looked like he had aged a decade in the span of a 2-minute phone call. What now? I asked. The federal prosecutors want to sit down with you. It turns out you aren't the only family Stephanie played. What does that mean? Marcus dragged his hands down his face. There are at least 6 other families where she ran the exact same playbook. She convinced the adult kids that their elderly parents were living comfortably while she bled their accounts dry. 6 other families. Yeah, and in a couple of those cases, the parents died without their kids ever knowing the squalor they were actually living in. The sheer gravity of what he was saying hit me like a freight train. Are you saying... I'm saying that if I hadn't randomly driven up here that afternoon, if I hadn't casually asked about that damn country house, you could have... He couldn't even finish the sentence. Died of neglect, while my son thought I was living in luxury. Marcus nodded, the tears finally spilling over his eyelids. We sat in the heavy silence for a very long time, letting the sheer evil of it all settle in the room. This wasn't just theft. It wasn't just a con. It was something incredibly dark. Marcus, I finally said, cutting through the quiet. Where do we go from here? Stephanie is sitting in a federal holding cell. The judge denied bail because of the sheer amount of cash involved and the massive flight risk. His voice was dead calm, completely stripped of emotion. The feds want you to take the stand and testify about what she did to you. Me? In federal court? Yes. Your testimony is the linchpin. It proves her exact pattern of psychological manipulation. It shows exactly how she justified the embezzlement. The thought of sitting in a courtroom terrified me. But underneath the fear, I felt a spark of something I hadn't felt in years. Power. The power to drag the truth into the light. The power to make absolutely sure Stephanie paid for every single thing she broke. When? I asked. 2 weeks. But Mom, there's something else you need to know. What? Marcus looked at me with a strange, complicated expression, a mix of deep shame and fierce determination. Whenever Stephanie gets out of prison, if she ever gets out, she is going to be completely destroyed financially. Every red cent she stole has to be paid back to the victims in restitution. He took a slow breath. And that includes the money she stole from you. What are you saying? I'm saying the $12,000 she intercepted, plus interest, is coming back to you. And that's not all. He pulled a legal document from his folder. I am personally suing Stephanie for intentional infliction of emotional distress. My legal team is convinced we can secure a massive settlement for the hell she put you through. For the first time in over 2 years, I felt something remarkably close to hope. I wasn't just going to get my life back. Stephanie was going to pay for every lie, every twisted game, every single night I spent crying in the dark, wondering why my son didn't love me anymore. And what about us? I asked softly. What happens to us? Marcus dropped to his knees again and gripped my hands tight. We are going to be okay, Mom, I promise you. You are never, ever going to feel invisible again. That night, for the first time in 24 months, I slept completely through the night, knowing the absolute truth had finally seen the light of day. The day of the trial rushed in faster than I was ready for. Marcus had insisted on buying me a sharp new dress for the courtroom, something that made me feel bulletproof and respected. It was the first time in years I had put on clothing that didn't come from a thrift store clearance rack. When we walked up the steps of the federal courthouse, James was waiting for us by the massive glass doors, standing next to a sharp-looking federal prosecutor named Sarah Chen. Evelyn, Sarah said, shaking my hand with a firm, confident grip. Your testimony is the bedrock of this case. Are you ready to do this? I nodded, even though my stomach was tying itself into knots. Is Stephanie going to be in the room? She'll be sitting at the defense table with her attorney. But don't you worry about her. We are going to build a wall right around you. When the heavy wooden doors swung open and we walked into the courtroom, my eyes instantly locked onto Stephanie. She looked entirely different. Smaller, hollow. Her signature blown-out hair was tied back in a harsh, flat style. The expensive jewelry was completely gone. But when her eyes met mine across the room, that same dead-cold arrogance was still burning right there in her stare. Marcus took a seat in the gallery right behind the witness stand. I could practically feel the heat radiating off him every time he glanced at his wife. How are you holding up? I whispered to him. I feel like I spent 5 years sleeping next to a total stranger, he muttered, his voice dripping with venom. The prosecutor stood up and laid out the nightmare. She walked the jury through the $500,000 in stolen federal funds. She walked them through the destroyed families. She exposed the cold, calculated manipulations Stephanie had perfected. But when she finally said my name, my heart hammered against my ribs. One of the most devastating casualties of the defendant's greed is Evelyn Morrison, her own mother-in-law. For over 2 years, the defendant systematically intercepted funds meant for Evelyn's survival, actively isolating her from her only son through a masterclass of lies and psychological abuse. When the bailiff called my name, my legs felt like lead as I walked up to the witness stand. The judge, an older man with sharp but kind eyes, gave me a reassuring nod. Mrs. Morrison. Sarah Chen began her voice, carrying clearly across the silent room. Can you walk the jury through your financial reality before your daughter-in-law took control of your son's financial transfers? I lived quietly, I said into the microphone, but I managed. Between Social Security and the money Marcus sent, I kept the lights on. And after? I took a slow, jagged breath. After the floor fell out, Marcus just vanished. The money stopped. The visits stopped. The phone calls stopped. I truly believed my son had thrown me away. Did you attempt to contact him during this blackout period? Dozens of times, but my calls went into the void. His assistant always told me he was simply too busy to pick up. I sat up there and laid my entire nightmare bare for the room. every humiliating detail. The nights I went to sleep starving, the medication I couldn't afford, the pure, degrading shame of begging friends for pocket change just to survive the week. How did it feel when you finally realized your son had been sending you support that entire time? Sarah asked quietly. It gutted me, I answered, looking straight at the jury. Not because of the stolen money, because of the stolen time. The years I lost with my boy, the memories we didn't get to make, all because she built a wall between us to cover her tracks. When Stephanie's defense attorney stood up for cross-examination, I braced myself for a bloodbath. I expected him to tear into me, to paint me as a confused, bitter old woman. Mrs. Morrison, he began, his voice slick and smooth. Is it fair to say you and my client never really saw eye to eye? I wouldn't phrase it exactly like that. Isn't it a fact that you actively disapproved of your son's marriage? You never thought Stephanie was quite good enough for him, did you? I just wanted my son to be happy. Sarah shot up from her chair. Objection, relevance. Sustained, the judge barked. The lawyer smoothly pivoted. Mrs. Morrison, isn't it entirely possible you simply misinterpreted my client's intentions? I didn't misinterpret scrubbing toilets for grocery money while my daughter-in-law blew my son's cash on luxury mud wraps. But you are a very proud woman, aren't you? A woman who fiercely values her independence. I am proud, yes. But having pride doesn't mean I deserve to be conned and robbed blind. Through the entire cross-examination, Stephanie never broke eye contact with me. There wasn't a single ounce of remorse in her face. Just pure, toxic resentment, like I was the villain who had ruined her perfect life. When the judge finally dismissed me, I walked back to the gallery and sat next to Marcus. He reached out, grabbed my hand, and squeezed it hard. You nailed her to the wall, Mom, he whispered. But the real shockwave hit the room when Stephanie actually took the stand in her own defense. Her lawyer carefully guided her through a highly rehearsed, victim-centric narrative. According to Stephanie, she was just an overwhelmed woman who made tragic mistakes, driven by immense financial desperation and the suffocating pressure of maintaining high society appearances. Can you explain to the jury why you didn't simply hand the money directly to Mrs. Morrison? Her lawyer asked gently. Well, Stephanie said, her voice shaking with perfectly calculated vulnerability. Evelyn can be incredibly difficult. She constantly complained that the money wasn't enough. She always demanded more. I honestly believe that if I used those funds to eliminate some of our crushing family debt, we'd be in a much stronger position to take care of her down the line. My blood ran cold. Sitting under oath, staring down the barrel of a federal prison sentence, she was still spinning lies. And the intercepted letters? Her lawyer prompted. I never intercepted anything. I simply managed the communication flow to prevent unnecessary friction. Evelyn thrives on drama, and I couldn't let her stress out Marcus while he was trying to build his career. Marcus went rigid beside me. I could feel the pure hatred rolling off him in waves. But then Sarah Chen walked up to the podium for cross-examination. Mrs. Morrison, Sarah began, her voice like cutting ice. Could you explain to the court exactly why you instructed your husband's assistant to treat your mother-in-law as if she had severe dementia? Stephanie stammered, the perfect facade cracking for the very first time. I don't recall using those exact words. You don't recall? Because I have a sworn affidavit right here from Mary Sanders, confirming you explicitly told her Evelyn Morrison suffered from early onset dementia, and that her delusional phone calls were severely impacting your husband's work. She must have misunderstood my concern. And can you explain why you utilized your mother-in-law's identity to justify $500,000 in fraudulent disbursements from your charity? That was simply a massive administrative oversight, an administrative oversight that lasted 36 months and involved forging medical documents. Sarah methodically dismantled every single lie, every pathetic excuse, every attempt Stephanie made to play the victim. With every question, Stephanie shrank a little further into the witness chair. Finally, Sarah dropped the hammer she'd been holding the entire trial. Mrs. Morrison, during the 24 months you were actively diverting your mother-in-law's survival money, did you ever feel a shred of guilt knowing she was literally starving while you used her cash to fund your luxury spa retreats? Stephanie didn't answer right away. For the very first time, the mask slipped completely. "I didn't know she was starving," she finally snapped. "I didn't know. I didn't know $800 a month wasn't enough to survive on. I didn't know a 64-year-old woman was scrubbing floors to buy bread. I assumed she had a safety net." "What safety net?" "According to the financial disclosures we seized, you knew her exact income down to the penny. In fact, you explicitly used her poverty status to justify embezzling federal funds." Stephanie slumped back in the chair. She had absolutely nothing left to say. When the gavel banged at the end of the day, Marcus and I walked out of the courthouse in dead silence. We made it all the way to the parking garage before he finally cracked. "How the hell was I so incredibly blind?" he asked, leaning his head against the cold steel of his car. "Because she is a master manipulator," I told him, "and because you wanted to believe in the life you built. But you're my mother. It was my job to protect you." "Marcus," I said, reaching out and gripping his arm, "let it go. She played a brilliant game. What matters right now is that the lights are finally turned on." That night, while we sat up waiting for the jury to come back, Marcus asked me a question that shifted the ground beneath us. "Mom, can you ever actually forgive me?" "There is absolutely nothing to forgive," I told him. "You were sitting in the exact same trap I was." "But there is. I should have trusted my gut. I should have driven up to that house no matter what lies she fed me." I looked at this grown man, the boy I had raised, who had climbed to the top of the world but lost his bearings along the way. "I forgive you," I said softly, "but only if you promise to figure out a way to forgive yourself." The next afternoon, the jury came back. Guilty on all federal charges. The judge handed Stephanie a mandatory minimum of 8 years in federal lockup. When I heard the sentence read aloud, I didn't feel the rush of vicious satisfaction I thought I would. I just felt incredibly tired and deeply, profoundly relieved. The nightmare was finally over. 6 months after the gavel dropped, my reality was completely unrecognizable in the best possible way. Marcus had made good on every single promise he made in that kitchen. The house I live in now is small, but the deed has my name on it. It's got 2 bedrooms, a little patch of earth where I grow heirloom tomatoes, and a kitchen window that catches the sunrise every single morning. It isn't a mansion, but it's my sanctuary. After spending years living on borrowed time and the charity of others, turning my own key in my own lock feels like pure magic. Marcus drives up every single Sunday. We stand in the kitchen and cook together, something we never had the luxury of doing when he was a kid, because I was always working 3 jobs just to keep the heat on. Now we actually have the time to sit and talk to figure out who we are as adults. "Do you have any regrets?" he asked me last Sunday while we were prepping tacos, a new tradition we had built from the ground up. "About what?" I asked, though I knew exactly where his head was at. "About suffering in the dark, about not screaming louder." I put down my knife and looked at him. The last 6 months had put some miles on his face, but it was a good kind of age. He looked grounded. He looked real. "Marcus, if I had somehow gotten through to you, if I had told you she was cutting me off, would you have actually believed me?" He went dead quiet, genuinely chewing on the question. "I don't know," he finally admitted. Stephanie was terrifyingly convincing. She always had the perfect answer ready. "Exactly. You had to hit the wall and see the wreckage for yourself." The civil settlement had been massive. Marcus's legal team didn't just claw back the $12,000 Stephanie stole from me. They hammered her estate for emotional damages. When the dust settled, I walked away with nearly $100,000. It was more cash than I had ever seen in one place. But the money wasn't the prize. The prize was getting my dignity back. The local papers had run with the story, but they didn't paint me as some pathetic, helpless victim. They wrote about me like a survivor. Within weeks, a handful of local advocacy groups reached out, asking if I'd be willing to talk about elder financial abuse. It turned out I wasn't an isolated case. There was an entire silent army of older folks out there being quietly bled dry by the people they trusted the most. Mrs. Morrison, a community organizer, told me after a meeting, You could pull a lot of people out of the dark if you just stood up and told your story. That's how I found myself standing at podiums in community centers, breaking down the red flags of family financial exploitation. It wasn't exactly how I pictured spending my mid-60s, but it turned out to be incredibly healing. After one of my talks, a 68-year-old woman named Ellen walked up to me. Her own daughter had been quietly draining her pension account for 3 years. Her nightmare was a carbon copy of mine. "How do you ever get over the betrayal?" she asked me, her hands shaking. "One morning at a time," I told her straight. "And by realizing that what they did has absolutely nothing to do with your worth and everything to do with their emptiness." Ellen started crying right there in the aisle. "But she's my daughter. I'm supposed to love her no matter what." "You can love someone from a distance while keeping your doors locked," I said, grabbing her hands. "Drawing a line in the sand doesn't make you a bad mother. It makes you someone who refuses to be a victim." Those late-night talks saved me just as much as they saved them. Every story I heard was a reminder that I wasn't alone, that I hadn't been foolish for trusting my own blood. Marcus started seeing a therapist right after the sentencing. "I need to unpack how I let a predator sleep in my bed for 5 years," he told me. "Not just for what she did to you, but for my own sanity." The divorce was fast and brutal. Stephanie had absolutely zero leverage left to fight with, and Marcus walked away clean. The massive house they shared was liquidated to pay off the mountains of federal restitution she owed. "Do you ever miss her?" I asked him once, genuinely curious about the scars she left behind. "I miss the ghost I thought I married," he said, staring out the window. "But the woman sitting in that cell, I never actually knew her." One Friday afternoon, while I was out back watering my tomatoes, I heard a hesitant knock at the front door. I wiped my hands and opened it to find a young woman I didn't recognize standing on my porch. "Mrs. Morrison?" she asked, shifting nervously. "I'm Jessica, Stephanie's niece." My gut reaction was to slam the heavy wooden door right in her face, but the absolute heartbreak in her eyes stopped me cold. She looked humiliated but determined. "What can I do for you?" I asked, keeping the screen door shut between us. "I just drove down here to apologize," she blurted out, "for what my aunt did. The entire family is absolutely sick to our stomachs. We need you to know we had no idea what was happening." I pushed the screen door open and motioned for her to sit on the porch swing. For the next hour, Jessica sat there and unloaded the rest of the lies. Stephanie had been playing her own family too, feeding them a story about how Marcus was completely emotionally abusive toward me, and how she was the only one secretly keeping me afloat. "We genuinely thought you were the villain," Jessica admitted, wiping her eyes. "Stephanie swore you were this toxic, manipulative woman trying to sabotage her marriage." "And what do you think now?" "Now we know exactly who she is, and we just wanted to look you in the eye and tell you that if you ever need anything, we are here." After Jessica drove away, I sat on that porch for a long time, just wrapping my head around the sheer scale of the destruction Stephanie had caused. She hadn't just poisoned my life and Marcus's life. She had weaponized her own family, turning them into pawns in her sick little game. When Marcus came over for our Friday night dinner, I told him about the visit. "How did that sit with you?" he asked. "Honestly, it felt like exhaling," I said. "Knowing her family doesn't hate our guts takes a lot of the weight off." "Have you ever thought about driving up to the prison to look her in the eye?" he asked out of nowhere. The question caught me off guard. Why would I put myself through that? I don't know, closure? To watch her squirm and apologize? I thought about it for a hard minute. I don't need her apologies, Marcus. I already have everything I could possibly want. Which is the absolute truth, your respect, my own front door. I looked right at him. And the quiet satisfaction of knowing she can't touch another soul for a very, very long time. Marcus smiled. It was the first real, unburdened smile I had seen on his face in a year. "You know what, Mom? You're damn right." 3 months later, a plain white envelope showed up in my mailbox. It was from Stephanie, stamped right out of the federal penitentiary. "Evelyn," the letter started, "I know I have absolutely no right to ask for your forgiveness. but I need you to know the regret is eating me alive. I have no excuses left. I just hope you find some peace." I read the words twice, folded the paper, and dropped it into the bottom of a desk drawer. Maybe one day I'd write back. Maybe I'd let it rot in there. But the one thing I knew for absolute certain was that my peace didn't require her permission. When I turned 65, Marcus threw a backyard barbecue at my place. He invited Ellen and a dozen other women I had met through the advocacy groups. A few of my old neighbors even showed up, the ones Stephanie had successfully chased away with her lies, who had finally learned the truth. While I stood over the cake, staring down at the flickering candles, I made a quiet wish. It wasn't for revenge. It wasn't for a bigger payout or an easier life. I just wished for more afternoons exactly like this one. Days spent breathing easy, surrounded by people who looked at me and saw a person, not an easy mark. "What did you wish for?" Marcus asked as I sliced the cake. "Nothing at all," I smiled. "My plate is already full." And it was the absolute truth. At 65, I had learned the hard way that real wealth isn't sitting in a bank account. It's in the people who show up when the house is burning down. It's in the quiet dignity of paying your own way. And it's in the power of pulling someone else out of the fire once you've survived the flames. Stephanie had tried to strip me down to the studs, my money, my son, my name, my sanity. But when the smoke cleared, she had failed at the only thing that actually mattered. She didn't break my spine. Every single morning, when I stand at my kitchen window and watch the sun break over the horizon, I don't feel bitter about the hell I walked through. I feel incredibly proud of the woman who walked out the other side. The scales had finally balanced, but more importantly, I had found my way back home. A life lived on my own 2 feet, surrounded by the truth and entirely on my own terms. Yeah.